we've got a hole at the National Security Council in terms of competence, because more important possible than Walz being removed is that many of the staff on the National Security Council have been removed. In part, they've been removed because of this crazed, and I do mean crazed, hard right activist named Laura Loomer, who keeps wandering into the White House with absolutely no authority whatsoever and saying, I want this person fired, I want this one fired, I want this one fired. But then she repeats it on social media for several days, and they wind up firing people. And that's reaching down into not just the senior, but the middle levels of the National Security Council. And there is a takeaway line in a big report that the Washington Post did on how Walz was pushed out. And it's the most important line in the article, which is some people in administration say this is part of Trump's attempt to move out the policy experts, move them out at the middle ranks of NSC and bring loyalists down.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Scott Lucas from the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Scott, thank you very much for joining me again today.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me here on a fine sunny day.
Well, following Mike Walz being removed as National Security Advisor, President Trump seems to have named J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio as his possible successors. Is this a significant shift in the sort of voices of influence in the White House?
It could be a significant shift in influence in the White House, but let's walk through the move at multiple levels here. First of all, the way that Trump tells it, he promoted Mike Walz. Not sure Walz agrees, but it's like, oh yeah, we'll make him, ambassador to the UN, and that's a great post. It's one I'd rather have. And the reality here is the ambassador to the UN is more a spokesperson for the administration than someone who's involved in terms of tactics and strategy, as you are at the National Security Council. And Mike Walz, was one of the key players in terms of, the chaotic Trump foreign policy, along with Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, probably J.D. Vance, getting his nose stuck in as vice president. I'm not sure the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, has much to do with this because he's still finding out where his feet are. But the fact is that I have been saying for weeks, you and I discuss this, that if the Trump administration split factions, whereas you've got, Vance, extremely ambitious with no interest in European Ukrainian security, and the real estate developer Steve Witkoff on one side, then Walz was possibly one of the adults on the other side, along with the envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, and maybe Rubio. And there's a big question mark I have over Rubio. Now Walz is gone, and it's like, okay, do you still have adults in the room here? Because trust me, Trump hasn't learned anything about Ukraine since Walz was dismissed. Vance certainly hasn't softened in his, using Europe as a punching bag. And Witkoff continues being the super envoy Witkoff, whichever country he's visiting this week. And I think the interesting shift here before we speculate who might replace this is that while Rubio is holding actually 4 posts, he's still head of the U.S. Agency for International Development, which is nominally on the books, even though it's been gutted by the Trump administration. And then he's got a 4th role as well. Rubio's going to be overstretched doing all these roles. But he's there. Kellogg is still there, and I think very important. And I think increasingly important, but possibly not noticed as much as the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. Now, we may make a reference to the minerals deal between Ukraine and the United States and realize, of course, that minerals deal is largely symbolic in terms of what it means for revenues. It's actually more of a door opener to getting the U.S. involved in Ukraine's security. Well, Bessent's the one who made the deal, and Bessent's the one promoting the deal, including in a big speech in Los Angeles just yesterday. So you look at all of that, and then you say, well, who can replace Walz? I mean, look, we don't know at this point. And some Trump administration people are giving a timeline of up to 6 months before they replace. Now, it's not going to be JD, because JD wants to be in the vice presidency. One, if Trump suddenly disappears, and heaven help us, we don't want that to happen, of course. But secondly, JD's setting up for a presidential run in 2028, so he doesn't want to move. I'd look more, the apocalyptic scenario is Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller, better known as a domestic policy advisor to Trump, especially, with the fact that he hates all foreigners, not just migrants. He hates foreigners. So, all this crazed anti-immigrant, anti-asylum seeker, anti-refugee policy, Miller's involved in all that. He's also involved in a lot of other damaging legislation on domestic side, but he's been getting more and more involved in foreign policy discussions. And someone was floating Miller's name just a few days ago. And the question was it Steve Miller's camp that were floating his own name around as a teaser? We don't know. I think what you can say here is that the problem we have is that we've got a hole at the National Security Council in terms of competence, because more important possible than Walz being removed is that many of the staff on the National Security Council have been removed. In part, they've been removed because of this crazed, and I do mean crazed, hard right activist named Laura Loomer, who keeps wandering into the White House with absolutely no authority whatsoever and saying, I want this person fired, I want this one fired, I want this one fired. But then she repeats it on social media for several days, and they wind up firing people. And that's reaching down into not just the senior, but the middle levels of the National Security Council. And there is a takeaway line in a big report that the Washington Post did on how Walz was pushed out. And it's the most important line in the article, which is some people in administration say this is part of Trump's attempt to move out the policy experts, move them out at the middle ranks of NSC and bring loyalists in. And I think that's the broader danger, even beyond who replaces Walz. Upshot right now is that since Walz has been removed, has there been a change in U.S. approach to Ukraine and Russia? And I'm actually going to give you a stinger here is, surprisingly, not only has there not been a change tilting back towards the Kremlin, but in fact, there are signs that the Ukraine is building up support for Ukraine, which is going to lead me to your next question. Well, Scott, how could there be an increase in support for Ukraine if Mike Walz has been moved out of the National Security Council?
Well, indeed. I mean, I was about to say at the same time we've seen the White House say it won't fly around the world mediating. The actual end point of that, result of that, seems to be to put the kibosh on Steve Witkoff's visits to the Kremlin. Is there a sign in that there's a beginning of the end for Trump's sort of attempt to cozy up to Putin, bring Russia in out of the cold?
No, but I think we need to walk through it and cut through the surface headlines. First of all, I can't miss the opportunity to speak again about the real estate developer and super envoy Steve Witkoff. And just a quick reminder, which is when it all went pear-shaped for the Kremlin. And let's just have the reminder that 10 days ago, just count back, 11 days ago, Witkoff's gone into Moscow, and he's supposed to be like sealing the deal with Vlad that the U.S. was going to impose on Ukraine, right? But of course, Vlad had unsettled that deal by, killing people, mass murder in Kyiv the day before. And so like all of a sudden there's the U.S. Trump's upset with Putin because he's killing people. Europe and Zelensky have an opening. Witkoff goes into Moscow, and Vlad's doing his part to get the advantage back. He greets him in English and says, "Hey, how you doing, Steve? Great to see you. How's the real estate going? You want to buy anything in Moscow? Maybe put a Trump Tower up, and okay, come on over to the table, Steve." And and there's, all the big guys. There's Ushakov, Vlad's top foreign policy advisors there. There's Kirill Dmitriev, top financial advisor. There's Steve there. And there's no one with Steve. There's no one. Steve is there on his own. The super envoy, Steve Witkoff, and he's such a super envoy, he turns and looks at the woman who is on his side of the table and goes, wait, are you my translator? Are you from the embassy? We still don't know whether or not she was from the U.S. embassy or whether the Russians had provided the translator for the super envoy, Steve Witkoff. And of course, the important thing is that, look, if you're an adult in the room at all, you know how hapless he is. And there are some people who are leaking to the media that he's seen as a blustering fool. But let's take this back to the U.S. approach and what's important. Look, the headline stuff, and Marco Rubio does this every flaming few days, or JD does it. We're just going to walk away. That's it. We're going to take our ball and go home, and, nobody will be able to play anymore, and boo to you and whatever. Yeah, right. Look, first of all, that's what Trump does on everything when it gets tough. And the big story which we could also be talking about today, is, just in case no one noticed, Israel's just announced a long-term occupation of Gaza, right? And it's like, oh, where's Trump now? The guy who said he was going to bring an Israel-Gaza deal, and it's like he's nowhere. He's absolutely checked out on that. If he doesn't get a quick nuclear deal with Iran, he'll check out on that, right? It's what Trump does. When the going gets tough, Donald goes away, and so the going's gotten tough here, and it's gotten tough because Putin doesn't want a ceasefire unless he gets an unconditional surrender of Ukraine to his terms. Okay, let's just repeat that. Putin does not want a ceasefire unless he gets control of Crimea, plus most of, at least, and possibly all of 4 regions of Ukraine, 2 in the east, 2 in the south, and he really wants to follow the Zelensky government as well, and he wants the lifting of sanctions on Moscow. Now, he's not going to negotiate on a ceasefire unless he thinks he can get that, okay? So what does the U.S. do? Do they just simply walk away? Here's the stinger, which I had told you about just a couple minutes ago. U.S. institutions, and despite Trump's attempt to destroy them, U.S. institutions are now invested in Ukraine, right? U.S. military has been invested in Ukraine all along. They were during the Biden administration, and I'm talking about the guys who actually do the stuff, not Pistol Pete Hegseth. I'm talking about the military commanders. I'm talking about the guys who do logistics. I'm talking about the guys who do support for NATO. I'm talking about all the guys. They're invested in this, right? Career diplomats in state, they're invested in Ukraine. Now, with the rare earth minerals deal, U.S. financial sector and Treasury are invested in Ukraine, right? Even if you can't get those minerals out immediately, you're saying in the long term, we want this 50-50 deal where we get half the profits from that. Well, if you're going to do that, you have to protect the people who develop the infrastructure for those rare earth minerals deals. So the U.S. is now invested in providing security for whoever's involved with the rare earth minerals deals. So all of a sudden, at the level of the institutions, beyond all this chatter, Trump, Rubio, Vance, they're invested. So what happens in the past week? And here's the tips. 1, the Trump administration lifts the suspension of military aid to Ukraine, starting with any provision of deliveries up to $50 million in value, which includes, for example, 50 caliber ammunition for machine guns, right? So all of a sudden, remember, Trump, who only a few weeks ago cuts all military aid, cuts intelligence sharing, now you get the 50 million. I said, a couple days later, we get confirmation that the U.S. is taking old F-16 fighter jets that are no longer operational, and they're going to send them to Ukraine so they can be used for spare parts. This is part of a $310 million package, which also includes training and technical support. Whoa. Third, reports come out yesterday that a Patriot anti-air missile system is being transferred from Israel, which supposedly needs all the Patriots, being transferred from Israel to Ukraine, right? There's some folks within the administration that are making some serious moves. And I'm not saying serious compared to the level that Biden administration was providing, but serious in terms of removing that bar on military assistance to Ukraine. Still relatively small amounts, but in terms of the message it's sending, pretty significant ones. And what we have not gotten in the past week, because you don't do this loudly, you do not announce this loudly, is we do not know in terms of the U.S. officials talking to European officials who are also working with Ukraine. All of that has just gone low while Vlad says, I'll have a 3-day ceasefire for Victory Day. Zelensky says, let's make it 30 days. Trump puts something up on Truth Social that makes no sense, and we just go round and round.
So there is actually quite a lot for Zelensky to walk away from this Ukraine-US resources deal feeling pretty happy about, especially considering where this deal started off in Trump's mind.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I've got friends in Ukraine that are still split on this. There's still some who think he shouldn't have signed the deal, and I respect what they're saying, but I think you've summarized it well in terms of where we were just a month ago and where we got to. A month ago, after the initial deal fell apart at the end of February, because attack dog J.D. Vance decided to bite Zelensky's legs, that all fell apart, and then U.S. officials rebuilt the deal with Ukraine, but it started off with another U.S. ultimatum. I mean, it started off with, we want 100% of the revenues from the sale of minerals, of rare earths, and indeed of Ukrainian oil and gas, which takes place. And Ukraine's not going to give up 100%. And the Americans are also saying, well, you don't see a thing. You don't see any profits until we get repaid for $350 billion in assistance from the Biden administration, which was way more than the Biden administration had even provided. What starts off with is that, first of all, we find out that the number is being negotiated down. It becomes $200 billion to be repaid, then $100 billion, then the repayment disappears altogether. The 100% U.S. control becomes 50-50 control. So America's still going to get 50% of the profits, fair enough, if and when the rare earths are ever developed. But Ukraine doesn't have to repay anything to come off the top of all of that. So Ukraine gets much better terms out of it. And there's also some technical things in terms of taxation and so on I could go into as well, which had to be worked out. But I come back to the fundamental. This might affect certain minerals that are not rare earths that will be sold on, et cetera. It might affect Ukrainian oil and gas, but the rare earths are going to take years to develop. And Ukraine knows that. And when Zelensky went to the White House in February to try to sign the initial deal, the reason why you had the bust up with Vance is Zelensky was very open. We said, we want this linked to a security guarantee, right? Well, what they've got now, as I talked about a few minutes ago, is that they don't have a formal American security guarantee, but they've informally got America invested in Ukrainian security. And don't trust me, trust the sharp-eyed intellectual observer Donald Trump, who said after the deal was signed, we have people there, we have to protect them. And it's like, okay. And so Zelensky's quite pleased with it. And again, this is what makes me interested in Scott Bessent, right? It was Bessent who signed the deal as Treasury Secretary with the first Deputy Prime Minister, Yulia Sedorenko, in Washington. So it wasn't Rubio who signed it. It certainly wasn't JD, wasn't Trump. It was Bessent. And then it's Bessent who's gone out and promoted the deal in these speeches. And what Bessent says yesterday out in Los Angeles, he says, Donald Trump, Donald Trump is using this because he's going to put pressure on Russia and put leverage on that. Look, I'm going to repeat for you listeners out there, Donald Trump knows about as much as my cat about Ukraine, and my cat's really, really stupid. Right. So that, it wasn't Donald Trump that thinking I'm going to put leverage on Putin and so on. It's people like Scott Bessent and others with whom Bessent's working, Keith Kellogg probably, who are thinking, we put pressure on Putin with this, right? And again, do I actually think it's going to put pressure on Putin to make concessions? No. So I don't think it actually brings Putin back to the negotiating table in a serious sense. What it does is it just bolsters Ukraine's long-term resistance against Moscow.
So where does all of that leave this idea of a ceasefire or a peace deal in Trump's mind? I mean, we're now hearing that Trump might be going to Turkey to try and arrange some sort of mediation. Turkey have always been something of a backdoor into Russia through NATO. Is there any movement there we could see coming up?
We need to see, because the way Trump announced it is the first thing is Trump has a phone call with Turkish leader Erdogan, which he does periodically. And every time he does it, Erdogan plays him. I just a quick reminder why I'm always cautious about an Erdogan-Trump phone call. Back in 2018, 2019, there were two calls from Erdogan to Trump because Turkey wanted to invade northern Syria. And Trump said, okay, yeah, I'm going to withdraw the U.S. troops. You go on and do it. Like, okay. And that sent Syria into further mess there. So, Erdogan has played Trump in the past. In this case, Trump comes out and says, he's going to visit Washington and I might go visit him. And that's what Trump loves to do. And then meanwhile, we discussed Syria. We discussed Ukraine. We need to see what the adults in the room do on this. But, the reality is that Turkey it makes sense to bring Turkey in to mediate if there's anything to mediate. Turkey was the host of the Istanbul talks as Ukraine was trying to survive in March and April of 2022, actually got Ukraine and Russia close to an agreement before Vlad slapped on further conditions and scuppered that. Again, as Vlad does, asked for too much and overreached, and then will later pay the price for it. And then Turkey, very importantly, was the mediator for the Black Sea deal, which halted Russia's attacks on Ukrainian ports. At least, sorry, shouldn't say it halted the attacks on the ports. It limited the Russian blockade on the ports and allowed Ukraine ships to move through the Black Sea. Russia still attacked the ports from the air, but at least Ukraine could get some grain out. That was Turkey's work in terms of mediating that. And Erdogan likes to do this. He makes Erdogan look big and so on. So Turkey mediating, I think, actually makes sense if Moscow wants to come to the table. But kicker right here is that Moscow doesn't want to the table. But I'll tell you the big significance of this, and that is we now are 2.5 months since the U.S.-Russia first direct talks took place. Remember those back in February? I think they were in Saudi, if I remember correctly. And that at that point, it looked like U.S. and Russia were going to stitch up a deal. Ukraine not at the table, Europe not at the table. If you're talking about Turkey coming into the table, we're not talking about U.S.-Russia stitch up anymore. Europe's involved, Ukraine's involved, Turkey's involved now.
And I suppose on top of that, crucially, Turkey is a European NATO partner as well, which is a shift from the US's original stance that no, we're not involving Europe or NATO in this. It's our thing to sort out.
Yeah, I'm not sure some people think of Turkey as being European, which always gives it, it's like, okay, they're not a member of the EU and they're they've got a part of Asia as well. But I think your general point's absolutely right, that crucially, for all the bluster that, JD Vance goes around, trying to get rid of all of us because apparently we don't allow free speech here and we're overrun by immigrants and et cetera. JD, I am an immigrant, by the way. Just want to remind you. For all of JD's bluster for his own sake, the fact is that the U.S. can't walk away from Europe. In a meaningful sense, U.S. institutions can't walk away from Europe, and these negotiations have to go on. And rather than contracting, limiting, they're actually expanding. I will repeat that I think the key here is we all thought or feared that, Trump and Vlad were going to get their photo opportunity. It was going to be an ultimatum imposed on Ukraine, splitting the country, giving it absolutely no military strength, giving it no economic path to recovery. And what has happened is that as soon as Putin overreached, which I've talked about before, Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, other European leaders worked with Ukraine to get the U.S. adults in the room at least not walking away completely. And I can take this even further. The fact is, we were talking a few months ago that U.S. intelligence sharing meant that Ukraine would be absolutely wiped out on the battlefield. Ukraine still is holding the line for the most part in the east. Russia's gains have slowed there. Ukraine has expanded attacks inside Russia. They've hit several major installations in the last few days. And interestingly, overnight, Ukraine launched another cross-border incursion into Western Russia, into the Kursk region. Now, I think they did that just to wind Putin up ahead of Victory Day, which is on Friday. But still, it embarrassed the Russians, with one mayor saying, evacuate, run away, run away. And then a couple hours later saying, don't run away. Sorry, false alarm, because the Kremlin told him, stop evacuating this village. It doesn't look good.
Well, Scott Lucas, that's about all we have time for today, but thank you very much for joining me on the Trump Report.
Thank you very much.